It began on an ordinary Saturday morning, the kind of calm day that felt rare in a neighborhood ruled by the invisible hand of the homeowners association. The air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, and the sound of sprinklers ticked across the rows of identical suburban lawns. For Colonel Michael Reeves, recently retired from 22 years of service in the U.S. Army, it was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a simple day of clearing out the garage and finishing a long-delayed home project. Michael had bought his house on Oak Ridge Lane just a year earlier. The cul-de-sac seemed perfect at first, quiet, organized, and safe. But as he would soon learn, perfection often comes at the cost of control, and in this neighborhood, that control belonged entirely to one person, Karen Mitchell, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Karen was infamous for her clipboard, her relentless emails, and her ability to appear at your property line the moment you violated a rule, even by accident. Whether it was a slightly overgrown bush, a trash can left out 10 minutes past pickup, or a car parked an inch over the sidewalk, she noticed everything. And unfortunately for Michael, her house was directly across the street from his. That morning, Michael had backed his black pickup truck across his own driveway, blocking it temporarily as he unloaded tools and lumber for a backyard renovation. It was his property, his driveway, and his project. The truck wasn't even touching the street. But to Karen, it was an act of defiance. From behind her lace curtains, she saw the vehicle and immediately reached for her phone. The neighborhood had its rules: no vehicles obstructing access, no unsightly displays, no commercial activity, and in her mind, this was a clear violation. She didn't care that he was working on his own home, or that it was temporary. To her, it was a threat to the order she had spent years enforcing. Within minutes, Karen appeared outside, arms folded, wearing her signature pastel blouse and oversized sunglasses. She stood on the edge of her driveway, glaring at Michael as if he were trespassing on her personal kingdom. But Michael didn't notice her at first. He was focused, precise, deliberate, the same way he used to be during missions. When she finally called out to him, he only glanced her way briefly, offering a polite nod before turning back to his work. That small gesture, that lack of deference, lit a fire inside her. By the time Michael went inside for a break, Karen had already dialed the police. Her voice, firm yet dripping with exaggerated concern, described a suspicious man blocking driveways and potential illegal construction. She made sure to emphasize words like threatening and refused to comply. The dispatcher, bound by procedure, sent a patrol car to check it out. 15 minutes later, the quiet suburb filled with the distant wail of sirens. 2 police officers arrived, their vehicles parking at the end of the cul-de-sac. The neighbors peeked through curtains and blinds, curious and cautious. For many of them, HOA drama was a spectator sport. Michael stepped out of his house just as the officers approached. He wasn't alarmed, just confused. His posture was straight, his expression calm. The officers, polite but cautious, asked about the situation. Karen hovered nearby, pretending to be helpful but clearly reveling in the attention. She gestured dramatically toward his truck, repeating how he had blocked the entire driveway and refused to move. The irony, of course, was that it was his own driveway. The officers took one look at the scene and seemed to realize that immediately. Still, they followed procedure, explaining that a complaint had been made. Michael listened quietly, his hands behind his back, the faintest hint of disappointment crossing his face. After a moment, he stepped inside and returned with a single laminated card, a military ID that bore his name, rank, and an insignia the officers immediately recognized. Their demeanor changed almost instantly. The tone shifted from cautious to respectful. They apologized for the inconvenience, clarified that no violation had occurred, and quickly wrapped up the visit. Karen, however, didn't take it well. She argued, demanded they enforce community rules, and tried to assert that HOA regulations superseded property rights. The officers, growing visibly uncomfortable, reminded her that blocking one's own driveway wasn't a crime and that they had no legal authority to act on HOA complaints. As they left, Michael quietly returned to his work. But the damage was already done. The neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. Some admired his calm, others feared Karen's retaliation. And Karen, humiliated and seething, retreated indoors, already planning her next move. She wasn't used to being ignored, and certainly not by someone who had just made her look foolish in front of the police. By that evening, an official HOA notice appeared taped to Michael's mailbox. It cited obstruction of community access, unauthorized exterior work, and failure to obtain proper permits. Each charge carried a fine. It was absurd, but it was also classic Karen, precise, vindictive, and wrapped in bureaucratic language designed to intimidate. Michael read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it on his kitchen counter. He wasn't angry. He'd dealt with worse forms of harassment in war zones, from misinformation campaigns to political manipulation. He recognized what this was, a test. And he knew exactly how to respond, not with emotion, but with patience and precision. The following morning, Karen's gossip spread faster than wildfire. Neighbors began avoiding eye contact, afraid of choosing sides. A few secretly slipped notes of support into Michael's mailbox, thanking him for standing up to her. Others whispered that he was too strict, too quiet, or intimidating. But none of it mattered. Michael had weathered far worse storms. As the sun set on that quiet suburban street, Karen sat by her window once again, watching him finish his project under the amber glow of his porch light. To her, this was war, and she had no idea who she was up against. For Michael Reeves, the retired colonel who had commanded hundreds and managed crises most people couldn't imagine, this wasn't war. Not yet. But as he looked across the street at the woman plotting from behind her curtains, he knew one thing for certain: if she wanted to turn this into a battle, she would soon regret ever calling in the first strike. And so, as the cicadas hummed and the neighborhood slipped into uneasy silence, the first skirmish in the quiet war of Oak Ridge Lane came to an end, but it was only the beginning. The following week arrived with an air of unease that seemed to cling to every corner of Oak Ridge Lane. The cul-de-sac, once filled with the friendly hum of lawnmowers and neighborhood chatter, had turned into a silent battleground of glances and whispers. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but everyone knew that a new conflict had begun, one between Karen Mitchell, the self-proclaimed guardian of community order, and Colonel Michael Reeves, the man who refused to bow. The first sign of escalation came quietly. A bright yellow envelope appeared on Michael's front door one morning, neatly taped and stamped with the HOA's emblem. Inside was a formal notice of violation, listing multiple infractions that read like a checklist of invented offenses: vehicle obstruction, unauthorized construction, unapproved materials, and even aesthetic inconsistency. Each came with its own fine, totaling nearly $800. Michael read it slowly, his jaw tightening slightly but his expression otherwise calm. He recognized bureaucratic warfare when he saw it. He had spent years studying it, in military briefings, foreign negotiations, and leadership conflicts. Power, he knew, didn't always come from authority. Sometimes it came from the illusion of control. And Karen had mastered that illusion. Across the street, she watched from her window, her lips curling into a small, satisfied smirk. To her, this was justice. Her reports, her citations, and her enforcement letters, all of it reaffirmed her identity as the protector of the community. What she didn't realize was that her latest stunt had just crossed into a realm she didn't understand: property law and due process. Michael spent that afternoon in his study, carefully reading through the HOA bylaws. The language was formal, vague, and intentionally intimidating. But as he read deeper, he found what he was looking for: contradictions, loopholes, and procedural violations. The HOA board, for all its bluster, had failed to follow its own rules. None of the fines were valid without a proper hearing or written authorization from the full committee. It wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. Still, Michael didn't respond immediately. He wanted to see how far Karen would go. And she didn't disappoint. Within days, her campaign intensified. Anonymous complaints began flooding the HOA inbox about noise, debris, even military-grade vehicles being stored on residential property. Neighbors who had once smiled at Michael now avoided him entirely, afraid of becoming Karen's next target. A few even joined her crusade, hoping to stay in her good graces. She rewarded their loyalty with gossip, painting Michael as an aggressive ex-soldier with anger issues and a dangerous temper. But behind the quiet facade of his home, Michael was documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every time-stamped photograph. Years of military service had taught him the value of evidence and of patience. He wasn't just defending his driveway anymore. He was building a case. Then came the unannounced inspection. One morning, Michael returned from a quick errand to find a white SUV parked halfway up his driveway. Karen stood beside it, flanked by two HOA board members holding clipboards. Without permission, they were photographing his yard, measuring fence lines, and writing down notes as though conducting a government audit. He didn't need to say a word. His mere presence made them stop. Karen, visibly flustered but determined to maintain authority, pointed at the ground, gesturing towards some minor landscaping issue as justification for their intrusion. But Michael simply took out his phone, calmly recording the entire scene. He didn't raise his voice or issue threats, he just let silence, heavy and deliberate, do the work. Within minutes, they left. The recording would later prove invaluable. That evening, a new letter arrived. Final notice before legal action. Karen was escalating her campaign, convinced that intimidation would make him fold. But Michael knew something she didn't: the HOA had just overstepped its legal boundaries, and the law was firmly on his side. He contacted a local attorney the next morning, a quiet, meticulous man named Daniel who specialized in HOA abuse cases. After reviewing the documents, Daniel confirmed what Michael had already suspected: the board had violated multiple state statutes related to privacy, due process, and property access. In short, Karen had turned the HOA into her personal weapon, and that weapon had just backfired. For the next few days, Michael stayed silent. He continued his home renovation, mowing the lawn, painting the fence, and waving politely to neighbors who barely waved back. To Karen, it looked like he was surrendering, and she became bolder. She sent one final notice, this time with an ultimatum: pay all fines within 72 hours or face property liens and forced compliance. That night, as the streetlights flickered on and the quiet hum of the neighborhood returned, Karen watched from her window again, sipping tea and savoring what she thought was victory. But across the street, under the dim glow of his porch light, Michael was preparing something she couldn't anticipate: not an act of defiance, but a calculated counterstrike. He had already drafted a formal complaint to the state's Department of Real Estate and HOA Oversight Board. Attached were copies of every letter, every unauthorized inspection, every false accusation. He didn't include speculation, only facts, dates, and photos. His military background made the report read like an operation briefing, methodical and irrefutable. 3 days later, when the HOA board met in the community center, a state official arrived unannounced. The timing was perfect. Karen's smug confidence dissolved the moment the official began questioning her documentation. She stammered through explanations, tried to deflect blame onto community concerns, but the evidence spoke louder than her excuses. The investigation didn't end that day, far from it. But Karen had been exposed. The same neighbors who once feared her began to whisper again, this time about accountability. Something had shifted in Oak Ridge Lane. And yet, Michael wasn't celebrating. He knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't surrender, they doubled down. And sure enough, late that night, he saw her porch light flick on. Her blinds moved slightly, her silhouette framed against the dim glow inside. She was watching again, plotting. Michael closed his curtains and turned off his lamp. Whatever came next, he was ready. He had faced far worse enemies, ones with power, intelligence, and soldiers behind them. Karen Mitchell was none of those things. But she was persistent, and persistence could be dangerous in its own way. The neighborhood had become a chessboard, and the first few moves were already made. What Karen didn't realize was that she was playing against someone who had spent decades mastering the art of strategy, someone who didn't fight out of pride, but out of principle. And as the night settled in and the street went quiet once more, Michael knew the next phase of this conflict was coming, and this time, he wouldn't just defend himself. He would dismantle the entire system that gave her power. The following week brought a subtle but unmistakable change in Oak Ridge Lane. For the first time since moving in, Michael could feel the weight of the neighborhood's collective anxiety shifting, away from him, and toward Karen. Whispers drifted between driveways, neighbors spoke in hushed tones at mailboxes, and the once invincible aura of the HOA queen was beginning to crack. Karen, however, refused to accept defeat. She told herself that the investigation was just a misunderstanding, that she could spin it her way. She had built her authority on fear and control for years, one setback wouldn't end her reign. She doubled down, rallying what remained of her loyalists within the board, promising that they would restore order once the dust settled. But the dust wasn't settling. It was rising, stirred by something she didn't see coming. Behind the calm exterior of his daily routine, Michael was orchestrating a quiet counteroffensive. His military discipline had taught him patience, precision, and timing, 3 things Karen lacked entirely. He began by filing a series of formal requests under the HOA's own bylaws, demanding access to all financial records, meeting minutes, and correspondence related to enforcement actions. According to state law, he had every right to review them as a dues-paying member of the community. Karen tried to block the requests, claiming the documents were confidential. But within days, she received a letter from the HOA Oversight Board reminding her of her legal obligations. She was forced to comply. The audit that followed was devastating. Michael discovered that the HOA's funds had been misused, small, consistent withdrawals labeled as administrative reimbursements that led straight back to Karen's personal account. Landscaping expenses were inflated. Maintenance contracts were awarded to companies owned by her cousin. And fines collected from homeowners had quietly disappeared from the ledger. It was corruption hiding in plain sight, disguised as community management. Michael didn't confront her directly. Instead, he compiled the evidence meticulously, creating a report that would make any inspector proud. He then contacted several other homeowners, not through gossip, but with professionalism and transparency. One by one, he showed them the documents. At first, they were skeptical. But when faced with undeniable proof, skepticism turned to outrage. The very neighbors who once avoided him now stood beside him. For the first time, Karen's control began to crumble. By the end of the week, a petition was circulating, one calling for an emergency HOA meeting to vote for leadership review and possible removal of the current president. According to the bylaws, if 1/3 of homeowners signed, the board was legally required to hold the vote. Within 3 days, nearly every resident had signed. Karen was furious. She called emergency board meetings behind closed doors, sent out frantic emails claiming Michael was coordinating a smear campaign, and even threatened legal action. But her words had lost their power. The neighborhood that once feared her was now watching her closely, questioning every move she made. Then, on a warm Thursday evening, the emergency meeting was held. The community center was packed, every seat filled, every voice tense with anticipation. Karen sat at the front table, her usual confidence replaced by a brittle smile. The board members sat beside her, pale and uneasy. Michael arrived last, calm as ever, carrying a simple folder of papers. He didn't speak often that night. He didn't need to. The documents did all the talking. Every misused dollar, every unapproved action, every policy violation, presented in clear, irrefutable terms. Gasps rippled through the room as each page was projected onto the screen. The neighbors, once divided, were united now by something stronger than fear, betrayal. Karen tried to defend herself, blaming clerical errors, misunderstandings, even volunteer fatigue. But it was over. When the vote came, it was unanimous. She was removed from her position effective immediately, pending legal review of her conduct. For the first time in years, the residents of Oak Ridge Lane walked out of a meeting feeling free. The HOA had lost its tyrant, and they had Michael Reeves to thank for it. But freedom, as Michael knew, was never simple. In the days that followed, Karen's humiliation turned to rage. Her once pristine house now stood dark most nights, the blinds always drawn. Some said she was preparing to move. Others whispered that she was planning something worse. Michael didn't speculate. He just kept living his life, fixing his fence, washing his truck, and maintaining the quiet discipline that defined him. Then, one evening, as he sat on his porch, he noticed something strange. His truck, the same one that had started all of this, had a deep scratch along the side, a deliberate gouge in the paint. A petty act of vandalism. He didn't need to guess who had done it. He didn't report it. Not yet. Instead, he installed a set of motion-activated security cameras around his property, discreet, efficient, and impossible to miss once they started recording. Over the next few nights, the cameras captured her Karen, sneaking across the street under cover of darkness, tampering with his mailbox, leaving anonymous notes on his windshield, even attempting to loosen one of the screws on his fence gate. Michael didn't confront her. He let her hang herself with her own actions. By the end of the week, he had hours of footage. He submitted it all, to the police, to the HOA Oversight Board, and to his attorney. This time, it wasn't a civil issue. It was criminal harassment and property damage. When the officers arrived at Karen's door, the neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Her defiance had finally met reality. The woman who had once called the police on others was now being questioned by them. Michael stayed inside, watching from his window. He didn't feel joy or vindication, only quiet closure. He had defended his home, not through anger, but through discipline and truth. Yet even as the patrol car pulled away, he knew this chapter wasn't quite over. People like Karen rarely disappear quietly. They retreat, they brood, and they find new ways to strike. That night, the street was still. The air was heavy with the echoes of everything that had unfolded, the battles fought, the masks removed, the order restored. Michael turned off his porch light, took one last look across the empty road, and whispered to himself words he hadn't said in years: mission nearly complete. The war for Oak Ridge Lane was almost over, but there was still one final move to make. The weeks that followed were strangely peaceful, the kind of peace that felt temporary, fragile, like the eye of a storm that hadn't quite passed. The air on Oak Ridge Lane was lighter now, the tension that once hung over every mailbox and manicured hedge slowly beginning to lift. Neighbors waved again. Children played in the cul-de-sac. The fear that had ruled the community for years was dissolving, replaced by a cautious sense of normalcy. But beneath that calm, something darker was still brewing. Karen Mitchell had vanished from public view. After the police visit, she stopped attending HOA meetings, ignored calls from the board, and refused to answer her door. Her blinds remained closed day and night, her front yard neglected, an unthinkable sight for the woman who once fined people for crooked mailboxes. Yet, despite her absence, her presence was still felt. The gossip, the speculation, the rumors of revenge, they all lingered like smoke after a fire. Michael Reeves, ever vigilant, didn't let his guard down. He continued his daily routine, his early morning jogs, his tidy landscaping, his quiet evenings on the porch. But the soldier in him sensed unfinished business. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. People like her needed an audience, needed control, needed the last word. And sure enough, the final act of her defiance arrived one rainy morning. A thick envelope, unmarked and stuffed into his mailbox, contained a letter written in Karen's unmistakable, rigid handwriting. It was a rambling tirade, part confession, part justification, part veiled threat. She accused him of ruining her reputation, of conspiring against her, of weaponizing the very system she had once ruled. She wrote that she had friends in higher places, that she would make sure the truth came out, and that no one humiliates Karen Mitchell without consequences. Michael read it once, then again, noting every word, every implication. He didn't respond. Instead, he handed it directly to the local police department, adding it to the existing harassment file. He knew what she was trying to do: provoke him into confrontation, drag him down to her level, force him into reacting emotionally. But discipline was his armor, and silence was his weapon. Days turned into weeks, and then, something unexpected happened. The state's HOA Oversight Board completed its investigation. The findings were damning: years of financial misconduct, fraudulent record-keeping, and abuse of authority. Karen was permanently banned from serving on any homeowners association in the state. Several of her loyal board members were issued formal warnings. The HOA itself was placed under temporary administrative supervision until a new election could be held. For Oak Ridge Lane, it was the dawn of a new era. For Karen, it was the collapse of everything she'd built. When the news reached the community, it spread faster than any rumor she'd ever started. Some celebrated quietly. Others simply exhaled, as though waking from a long nightmare. Michael, as always, stayed silent. He didn't attend the announcement meeting. He didn't speak to reporters or neighbors seeking comments. He didn't need recognition. His victory wasn't about pride, it was about principle, about restoring fairness where fear once lived. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with Karen yet. A few nights later, long after midnight, the motion sensors on Michael's cameras flickered to life. The footage showed her, disheveled, pale, and furious, standing at the edge of his driveway once again. She didn't approach this time. She just stood there, staring at his house in silence. Then, after a few moments, she turned and walked away into the darkness, disappearing down the quiet suburban street she had once ruled. That was the last time anyone saw Karen Mitchell in Oak Ridge Lane. Within a week, her house was up for sale, listed by a realtor from outside the community, her name nowhere on the paperwork. She left behind nothing but rumors, fines she never paid, and the lingering cautionary tale of what power can do when mixed with ego. Life on Oak Ridge Lane slowly returned to what it should have been all along: peaceful, simple, ordinary. The HOA, under new leadership, became transparent and cooperative. The new president, a mild-mannered accountant, made sure every decision was documented, every rule voted on, and every resident treated fairly. The community garden was reopened. The annual block party, once banned for noise violations, returned to cheers and laughter. As for Michael Reeves, he remained what he had always been: steady, private, and quietly respected. Neighbors who once avoided him now sought his advice. Some even joked that the street was safer with a colonel living there. He never boasted, never brought up the past. But when people thanked him, he always gave the same answer: I just stood my ground. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the sky turned gold, Michael sat on his porch once more. The air was calm, the faint sounds of children playing echoing in the distance. He looked across the street, where Karen's house now stood freshly painted, new curtains in the windows, a young family moving in. The cycle of suburban life had reset, as it always does. He thought back to that first morning months ago, the sound of sprinklers, the smell of cut grass, and the moment Karen had called the police because he'd blocked his own driveway. It almost seemed absurd now, how something so small had ignited something so large. Yet, in its own strange way, it had revealed the truth about this neighborhood, and perhaps about people in general. Power reveals character. And sometimes, taking a stand, even over something as small as a driveway, exposes everything that was wrong beneath the surface. As the porch light flickered on and the evening breeze carried the faint scent of rain, Michael took a slow sip of his coffee and allowed himself a rare smile. The war was over. The mission was complete. Oak Ridge Lane was finally at peace. And somewhere out there, he hoped, Karen Mitchell was learning the hardest lesson of all: that control built on fear always crumbles, and that sometimes, the quiet man across the street isn't just a neighbor. He's the one who knows exactly how to end a battle without ever raising his voice.